Chapter 16, Section 3, Parliament triumphs in England. How did the British Parliament assert its right against royal claims to absolute power in the 1600s? It's kind of interesting when you look at this chapter. You've got these countries are on a continuum. On one end, you have France, where that is the most absolute monarch in all of Europe. There's no checks on royal power. The Estates General never meets. When you look at what Louis XIV does and having all of France revolve around Versailles, that is by far the most absolute monarchy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got England, which is the least absolute monarchy in England and in Europe. And so it goes somewhere in between, and we'll kind of look and see how England evolved into this less absolute monarchy. Even though they believe in the divine right and all those types of things, England was just a very different place. So by the end of the chapter, describe how the Tudor monarchs related with Parliament, how clashes between Stuarts and Parliament ushered in a century of revolution, how the English Civil War and the development of the Commonwealth led to the Glorious Revolution, and then explain the development of the English constitutional government throughout. And so when we look at the very first part, the Tudors were interesting in that they always were in need of money. And so because of that, you have Henry VIII and also Queen Elizabeth realize that even though they believe in this divine right, they have to negotiate with and work with Parliament. So they consulted Parliament. Now, Queen Elizabeth, for example, really controls Parliament in that she limits what people can talk about in Parliament, the issues that they can bring up. There's some things that just are non-negotiables, they can't discuss. And at the same time, she also has people who are working the inside of Parliament to help make sure that things get passed the way that she wants. So even though she consults, she still has an awful lot of control. But the big thing that comes out of this is that Parliament gets used to being asked for money. They get used to being asked for certain things. And so that gives them this sense of entitlement that this is going to continue, and that's going to lead to problems a little bit later on. The other thing that's going to cause lots of trouble for Stuarts is that Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth were powerful enough and strong enough to be able to really suppress or hold down some of these issues that are going to come bubbling to the surface. And because of that, when those do get to the surface and you have less able or maybe less popular leaders, they're going to struggle with how to deal with those types of things. So when we look at a century of revolution, the Stuarts issue a challenge. James I is a huge believer in divine right. God put me here, and so if you have a problem with it, you talk to God, otherwise you have to go through me first. And that attitude is going to run into an awful lot of problems. He gets into big fights over money and war. So because there's all kinds of war going on in Europe, they're expanding their military, they're getting into problems overseas. And a lot of times that war expansion also brings up the money problem because wars are expensive and costly. So he's constantly needing more money. And so he has to go to Parliament to ask for these things, and it's going to lead to a fight every time he goes. And the other big issue he has are the Puritans, the dissenters, these people who want to purify the church. And several of these kings are more Roman Catholic, and the Puritans want nothing to do with that. So that's going to set up showdowns with them as well. So Parliament responds. Charles I, again, needs money. And so he goes to Parliament begging for money, and they decide, well, you know what, buddy, you're going to have to sign this petition of right. It's going to limit the king's power even further from the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And so the things listed below are the things that the king could not do. Most importantly, probably collect taxes without permission, imprison people without cause. Now, one of the things that's interesting is this petition of right has a big influence on the U.S. Revolution, American Revolution, a little bit later on, because some of the things they're really complaining about are all these things that are listed in the petition of right that American colonists believe Great Britain has violated. After he gets his money and after signing the petition of right, he decides he doesn't want to deal with Parliament anymore, so he dissolves it. And so he says, you're not going to meet. And they don't meet for a period of about 10 years. And that gets to be kind of an interesting thing. And then eventually what happens is, again, he needs money, so he brings them back into session in 1640, and this is known as the Long Parliament, because from 1640 to 1660, but really from 1640 to 1653, it meets almost nonstop, which is one of the longest periods of time. And this is going to end up having a showdown between king and parliament, because when parliament comes back in, they execute some of Charles I's key advisors, including Archbishop Laud. They pass an act that parliament must be called at least every 3 years, and that parliament can't be adjourned without consent. And so Charles is going to head north to create an army to try and come in and deal with some of these troublemakers in the parliament. They escape through a back door, and this is going to lead to a civil war of Cavaliers versus Roundheads. Cavaliers, they're pro-king. They tend to be the nobles, the people who have most to lose if this system is overturned. The Roundheads are a mixed group. They're mostly Puritans, but you also see middle-class business people and merchants. You see some of these lesser lords or nobles who are looking to kind of move up in the world. They get their name from this short cropped hair. Their leader, Cromwell, creates a new model army where you advance through the army based on your merits, not based on who your folks are. So what he does is he accelerates those people who are ambitious and have a lot of ability. And this new model army, the Cavaliers can't deal with this army that allows people to advance based on merit. And they're just not prepared to be able to do that and fight against them. And so eventually what happens is the king is defeated and they execute the king. And Charles I faces this bravely. He says that he will give the signal for the executioner to chop off his head. He calmly approaches, he calmly says a prayer, he gives the executioner the signal, and the executioner chops his head off, which is what this painting is showing. This sends shockwaves through Europe. Now, you've had kings who have been assassinated, you had kings who abdicated, you had kings that were driven from power, but never before had a king been put to death. And this is going to really disturb other kings throughout Europe. And what Cromwell then does is he sets up a republic that doesn't have a king, and he calls it a commonwealth. Now, one of the interesting things that comes out of this is Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes grows up during this English Civil War, and he comes up with this idea of Leviathan. So both Hobbes and Locke believe in the social contract, that there's a contract between the people who are being ruled and the rulers. The difference is Hobbes believes that you need to have a strong monarch, like a sea monster, that will keep the people in check, and the people are naturally selfish, and they will be very self-destructive. So you need a leader and a ruler who will protect the people from themselves. So Cromwell, one of the things that Cromwell deals with is he's got a couple of natural inborn challenges to the Commonwealth. One is you've got Charles II, who's the natural heir to the English crown. He's still alive. He's not in England and Great Britain, but he's a threat to come back. Now, the other group is the levelers, who see this opportunity as a way to level all of society, and they call for the leveling of everything, that women should be allowed to vote, that all people should be raised economically and socially, and that we should get rid of this social order. And because of these problems, Cromwell eventually takes on the role of Lord Protector. He almost becomes a dictator. When you look at what's happening in Great Britain at the time, basically anything that is seen as fun or entertaining or non-religious, you're going to get in trouble for it. They ban all kinds of things. Not only are they going to purify religion, but they're going to purify society as well. They force all people to go to school because they need young people to be able to read and write so that they can read the Bible. Marriage, it gets changed a little bit. Marriage should be for really two key reasons, either for an economic benefit to the family or out of love. And so it's kind of changing a little bit. He also pushes religious toleration to an extent. He's tolerant of every religion as long as you're not Roman Catholic. So Roman Catholics continue to be persecuted. The Commonwealth is eventually going to end because after Cromwell dies, Everybody's sick of all these changes. They were too radical. I mean, you banned all kinds of things, from alcohol to card playing to theater, and people just think it's a little overkill and it's too much. So they asked Charles II to come back to be King of England. So Charles II does come back. He's pretty popular simply because he undoes all of the changes put in place by Cromwell. The other thing about him is he's very careful, he's very shrewd. He doesn't overstep. He doesn't try and appear like he's trying to do too much. He believes in the divine right of kings, but he plays a very careful political game. Unfortunately, he is replaced by James II, and James II is not careful and he's not shrewd by any stretch of the imagination. He is an openly practicing Catholic. He suspends a number of laws, including the writ of habeas corpus. He appoints Catholics to high positions, and what the people of Europe or England fear is that he is going to return England to Roman Catholicism, and that just isn't going to work either. And what comes out of this is the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is when England approaches William of Orange and Mary, the daughter of King James II. They are in the Netherlands, and they ask William of Orange and Mary to come be the kings and queen of Great Britain. And the deal is they can become king and queen as long as they agree to the English Bill of Rights. And these English Bill of Rights are going to have even more limits on the king. And it's going to make Parliament even more supreme than they were before. But it gives Parliament the power of the purse. That means any kind of taxation, any kind of spending, it has to go through Great Britain. It makes sure that habeas corpus, the right to trial, is enforced. And then also the Toleration Act. And again, the Toleration Act, it doesn't tolerate all religions. Roman Catholicism is one that is still persecuted against. And so we're seeing an even more limited monarchy being created. Kings and queens of Great Britain are not above the law. And so John Locke is growing up during this glorious revolution, and he has a very different view of mankind. And so even though he believes in the social contract, he believes that the best government is a very limited government, and that what governments are designed to do are to protect natural rights, the right to life, liberty, possessions, health. A lot of times possessions are considered to be the pursuit of happiness. And this is going to have a big influence on the American Revolution. So if we look at the constitutional government evolves, this is a step-by-step process. It started way back in 1215, and it kindly gradually developed. So what you start seeing is political parties emerging. Really, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads in some ways form political parties. You've got the Tories, which are the nobles and the aristocrats. They tend to be pro-king and protecting the status quo. You've got the Whigs, who are more urban, middle class, merchants. They want more religious toleration, and they favor Parliament over the king. And so these two political parties are going to kind of shape what's to come. The cabinet system evolves because eventually George I is brought in to become the king of Great Britain. He's German. He doesn't speak any English whatsoever. So what Parliament does is they create a group of advisors called the cabinet to help him make decisions. Now, eventually, that cabinet is going to create what's known as the position of prime minister. It's the leader of the majority party. If it's Tories, then you have a Tory prime minister. If it's Whigs, you have a Whig prime minister. And really, Robert Walpole is seen as the first prime minister and really shapes the cabinet that's going to lead to this constitutional government in Great Britain forming over the course of the next couple of centuries. So what you see forming is still a society that is ruled by a few. You have an oligarchy, which is a handful of people controlling everything that's going on. You've got the House of Lords, which is the traditional rich, noble aristocrats, these families that have been in power for centuries. The House of Commons is made up of wealthy business leaders and merchants and larger landowners that have kind of evolved and gained power and wealth over the past few centuries. And what they're going to do is they're going to form Parliament. The other thing is even though people are allowed to vote for the House of Commons, very few people are eligible to vote, probably less than 5% of the population. The other thing that happens during this period of time, and this is happening all throughout Europe, is the enclosure system. So these landowners are consolidating their powers, and they're enclosing their lands, and they're building fences. So as these fences are being built, what it does is it prevents peasants from having access to these common grazing lands and these common lands for farming. And it means that they don't have a way to feed their cattle or their livestock. And so many of them, when this enclosure system happens, they end up moving to the cities where they're unemployed, and they face a really horrible existence. Now, the other thing that's happening in Great Britain and really throughout Europe at this time is that there's a growing middle class, and this middle class has become more important economically and politically as we go. And especially when we get to the revolutionary phase that we're going to talk about here pretty quick, it's really the middle class that are going to lead this revolution, because they're outside of the system and they're outside of the political structure, and they want to have access to that.